She reported my cabin for its design. Here's how I turned her home into a dump site. You ever had a neighbor who just couldn't mind their own business? Well, Janet couldn't handle my cabin's design, and I thought, what if I gave her a taste of her own medicine? I followed every rule, but I didn't stop there. The HOA thought they had me trapped, but I had something up my sleeve. What happened next? Let's just say she didn't see it coming. Stay tuned to find out. Welcome back to the channel, HOA Unit, where we dive into the wildest HOA stories you won't believe. I'm Mark, your narrator for today's story. I live right here in the heart of suburbia, where things are supposed to be calm and orderly. But as you'll see, things are never as they seem. I've lived in my neighborhood for years now, dealing with all the usual HOA drama. But when Janet, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, took it too far, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Let me walk you through how one petty complaint turned into a full-blown revenge saga that no one saw coming. But before we get into the heart of it, grab some popcorn, because you won't want to miss a minute of this. I wasn't expecting this. Not at all. Janet, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had a problem with my cabin. My little piece of paradise in the middle of suburbia was apparently an eyesore. She stood in her front yard, arms crossed, eyeing my cabin like it was an alien spaceship that had just landed in the middle of the neighborhood. But hey, who could blame her? It wasn't like every house on the block looked the same. The cookie-cutter homes were all gray, beige, or white. My cabin stood out with its rustic charm and bold design, something different, and Janet hated it. At first, I tried to ignore the glares. What could she possibly do? This was my property, my home. But the HOA president had power, too much power. She had the whole neighborhood on a leash with her lists of rules and regulations. If someone dared step out of line, Janet would be the first to send a letter, followed by a fine and maybe even a legal threat. I could already feel the tension. The HOA had sent me a letter, one of those polite warnings, saying that my cabin didn't fit the community aesthetic. They said it didn't comply with their color scheme rules. Yeah, you heard that right. Apparently your home's color was supposed to be in line with the entire neighborhood. I didn't even know that was a rule. I thought I was in some sort of free country or something, not stuck in a dictatorship where your house's exterior was subject to someone's opinion. But the letter was only the beginning. I shrugged it off, thinking she was just some petty person trying to throw her weight around. Who gets that upset over a cabin design? But when the second letter arrived, and then the fines started, I started to feel like maybe I was in the wrong. Still, I didn't want to give up my right to have a place that felt like me. I wasn't about to let her dictate how I lived, so I kept doing my thing, thinking she'd forget about it. But she didn't. Janet was relentless. She started sending more letters, each one more formal than the last. And every time I saw her in the yard, she'd give me that look, like I was the one in the wrong. I could almost hear her thinking, this place will never be the same as it was before I took charge. And that's when something inside me snapped. I decided I wasn't just going to take it. I wasn't going to sit quietly and let her destroy what I had worked so hard for. I wasn't going to let her dictate how my house looked, what my design should be. So, I did what any sane person would do. I fought back. At first, it was just small things. I followed every rule to the letter and made sure she noticed. I trimmed my bushes perfectly, kept my lawn greener than anyone else's, and even painted my mailbox exactly how the HOA required. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough for her. Janet still found something to complain about. My driveway was a little too wide, my fence too high, my front steps not the right angle. It was like she had a personal vendetta against me and my house. But what if I could turn her own game back on her? I wasn't about to play fair. Janet thought she had all the power, but maybe it was time for her to feel the consequences of pushing me too far. And if the HOA could fine me for something as ridiculous as the design of my cabin, maybe I could find her back, in my own way. That's when I came up with a plan. I started thinking about all the things I could do. What would get under her skin? What would show her that I was just as capable of bending the rules as she was? I knew she loved her yard. She was always out there with a clipboard, marking down the perfect height for every plant, the perfect angle for every stone in her garden. She had everything in order, or so she thought. But what if I could take that order and flip it upside down? So I started small. I made a little mess. Nothing major, just a broken plastic chair in my front yard, a couple of old tires, a bag of trash. You know, just enough to get her attention. And sure enough, the next day she was out there standing at her window, glaring at my front lawn. It was almost like I could hear her growling through the glass. I didn't stop there, though. Over the next few weeks, I accidentally let more things pile up. An old mattress, some boxes, a few bits of discarded furniture. It wasn't like I was being reckless. I was still following the rules, technical. Young. But slowly, she started noticing that her perfect world was starting to fall apart. Her neighbors weren't happy. They started complaining to her about the mess. And the HOA? Well, they had their hands full trying to keep the neighborhood orderly, and now the chaos was coming from her own house. But the best part? Janet had no clue I was behind it. She thought it was just some accident or a random act of mischief. Little did she know, I was the one pulling the strings. The look on her face when she realized it was me? Priceless. But what would I do next? Would she retaliate? Or would she be forced to take a step back and realize that maybe, just maybe, she had met her match? The first time Janet walked up to my door after things started to escalate, I could see the anger in her eyes. Her face was flushed, lips pressed tight, and the way she stomped up to my porch, well, I knew this wasn't going to be a casual chat. This wasn't a, hey, how's the family type of interaction. No, she was ready to fight. Enough is enough, she spat, barely able to keep her voice steady. You're doing this on purpose. You think you're funny, don't you? I didn't even flinch. Instead, I leaned casually against my doorframe, giving her that innocent look, the one that people love to hate. The look that said, "What are you talking about?" I smiled just enough to show her I wasn't intimidated. "Oh, I'm sorry, Janet," I said, feigning confusion. "Doing what exactly?" She jabbed her finger at the growing pile of junk in my front yard, the tires, the mattress, the broken furniture, all placed in the perfect spots for maximum impact. "This!" she shouted. "You think you can just get away with this? I'm reporting you to the HOA again. You'll see what happens then." I knew she'd been planning to do that. I had seen her talking to the HOA board members at the last meeting, whispering and pointing in my direction. She was always trying to turn the neighborhood against me, but I had something she didn't. Patience. "Go ahead, Janet. Call them. I've got nothing to hide." I shrugged, keeping my voice calm, smooth. "But while you're at it, maybe check out your own lawn. It's looking a little off." She froze, glaring at me like she wanted to burn a hole through my chest with her eyes. The thing was, though, her pristine yard was starting to show signs of wear. The perfect lawn she had prided herself on, the one she made sure was never too tall, was starting to get overgrown. The hedges on the side of her house were getting a little wild, and there were patches of dirt in places that had always been neatly manicured. She wasn't about to let that slide. "Don't think you can mess with me. You're going to regret this." But I didn't regret anything. I was far from finished. Later that night, I sat in my living room, looking out at my cabin, my design, my rules. I wasn't going to let her tear it down piece by piece. If she wanted to play the HOA game, I would play it better, and I would do it in a way she would never expect. I had been following all the rules to the letter, cleaning up my yard, making sure my mailbox was at the exact right height, trimming the bushes just the way the HOA wanted. And yet, it still wasn't enough for her. Janet kept digging, kept pushing. So it was time to up the ante. I made a few calls. Nothing illegal, of course, but there were plenty of people who were happy to help make a point. I wasn't the only one she had irritated in the neighborhood. People were starting to get fed up with her constant scrutiny, the way she made them feel like they were living in her little world instead of their own. My neighbors started noticing the changes in her yard, and they weren't happy. That was when the real fun began. I started leaving little surprises on her property. Nothing too crazy, just enough to remind her that she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. I'd leave old broken appliances by her gate, maybe a few leftover construction materials near her driveway. It wasn't enough to cause a scene, but it was enough to make her go insane trying to figure out who was behind it. Every time Janet came over, she was angrier. Every time she went inside, I could hear her screaming at anyone who would listen. I could almost picture her pacing her house, trying to figure out what to do. But every time she made a phone call to the HOA, I was there too, talking to the neighbors, reassuring them that we could all work together to fix this mess. No one would go against Janet, but they wouldn't stand by her either. By now, I had her cornered. The HOA was starting to look like a joke. They were overworked, underpaid, and powerless to do anything. They had no real power when it came to stopping the chaos I was creating. And Janet? She was unraveling, bit by bit. The perfect, pristine woman she had once been, always in control, was slipping away. One evening, she stormed over to my cabin once again. This time, she didn't even try to hide her frustration. She didn't even knock. She just barged right in, flinging the door open with all the force she could muster. "This has gone far enough," she shouted, practically foaming at the mouth. I stood up slowly, no longer smiling, but not angry either. I was calm, watching her explode. There was something oddly satisfying about it. She had no idea that I had already taken everything she had tried to control and turned it into a joke. "You've ruined my life. I've tried to be reasonable with you, but now I'm going to make sure the HOA burns your house down with fines. They'll come down hard on you. I'm not going to stop until you're out of this neighborhood," she screamed. I looked at her, calm, controlled. "You've been trying to get me to leave for months now, Janet. But here's the thing. I'm not going anywhere. You can report me all you want, but it won't change anything." She narrowed her eyes, clearly not used to someone talking back to her like that. "You think you can just keep messing with me like this? You're a joke." The corners of my mouth turned up in a small smile. "No, Janet. You are the joke." And just like that, I saw her break. The walls she had built around her fell, piece by piece. She had thought she was in control, but now she was the one being controlled. She realized, just for a moment, that she wasn't the puppet master in this neighborhood anymore. But here's the real question. Who's really the fool in this game? The person who follows every rule to the letter and plays by the book, or the person who plays the game with a little creativity? The first time I saw her really lose it, I couldn't help but smile. Janet had always been the calm, collected one, the kind of person who would hide her emotions behind a cool smile and sharp words. But this time, she was shaking. The tension that had been building between us for months was finally coming to a head, and there was no way she could hide it any longer. She stormed up my driveway, her heels digging into the gravel with every angry step she took. It was clear she'd been planning this confrontation for a while, and I knew exactly what was coming. Her eyes locked onto mine as I stood at my door, pretending to look as relaxed as possible. The thing is, you could always tell when Janet was faking it. There was something about the way she stood, stiff, like she had a secret agenda. "You think this is funny?" she shouted, her voice quivering with frustration. "You think you can just break every rule in the book and get away with it? Well, you're wrong. The HOA is going to destroy you." She was right about one thing. She had been planning. The HOA had sent me more letters than I could count, each one more threatening than the last. Every time they tried to get me to comply with their rules, I just got more stubborn. I wasn't going to let some woman, who clearly thought she ran the whole neighborhood, push me around. The more she tried to control me, the more determined I became to show her who was really in charge. "I'm not going anywhere, Janet," I said calmly, crossing my arms. "In fact, I think I've got some changes planned for you." Her face flushed, and I knew I had hit a nerve. She stepped forward, as if trying to intimidate me with her presence, but instead of backing down, I just stood taller, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me squirm. "You don't get it, do you?" Janet snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "This isn't just about you and me. This is about everyone. The neighborhood is depending on me to keep things in order, and you are ruining everything." I couldn't help but laugh. She was acting like she was some sort of martyr, saving the neighborhood from my ugly cabin. In reality, she was just a petty little tyrant trying to control everyone's lives. But that was her mistake. She thought she could control me, but I wasn't about to let that happen. I knew exactly what she was afraid of, losing control, and that's where I could hit her, where it hurt the most. "You're right about one thing, Janet," I said, stepping closer. "This is about everyone, but it's not just your world we're living in. You can't control how everyone else lives. This neighborhood isn't just yours to dictate." She opened her mouth to retort, but I wasn't done yet. I needed to make my point crystal clear. "You've got the HOA wrapped around your finger. You're the one making all the rules, throwing fines at people for the smallest mistakes. You think you're above it all. But let's see what happens when I turn the tables." She stopped, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What do you mean by that?" I smiled. "I've been playing by your rules, Janet, following every guideline, every ridiculous request. But here's the thing. I'm done. If you're going to try to ruin my life over a cabin, then I'll make sure you get a taste of your own medicine." She stepped back, clearly confused. She had no idea what I was talking about, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I could see the shift in her expression, the way her hands clenched at her sides as if she were trying to control her frustration. She had no clue what was coming. Over the next few days, I kept up the pressure. I didn't let up. I made sure every rule was followed to the letter, just like I had before. But now, every time she came near my cabin, I made sure to show her that I wasn't intimidated. I'd smile, wave, and continue with my life as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, the neighborhood started to notice the little things happening around Janet's house. The perfectly manicured lawn that once stood proudly was starting to show cracks. The flowers she had so carefully planted were wilting. The garden she adored so much had started to look less pristine and more neglected. The more she tried to control my world, the more her own world started to crumble. But it wasn't just her lawn that was suffering. It was her reputation, too. Her carefully constructed image as the flawless, unflappable HOA president was beginning to crack. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up started murmuring about the way she treated people. She was no longer the golden girl of the neighborhood. She was a power-hungry bully. And that's when things really started to get interesting. I started hearing whispers from the other neighbors. They weren't on my side, yet, but they were starting to see through Janet's facade. They were tired of her rules and her condescending attitude. It was only a matter of time before someone else decided to stand up to her. And that's when I knew. It was time to take this to the next level. If I wanted to win this battle, I needed to be strategic. I started paying attention to the HOA's meeting schedule. I knew that Janet would be there, talking about how she was going to fix everything and make sure everyone followed the rules, but I wasn't about to sit back and let her get away with it. I had to get myself into that meeting. I had to show the board that they were being manipulated by a power-hungry dictator. The night of the meeting, I showed up early. I wanted to make sure I had the perfect seat, right at the front, where everyone could see me. Janet walked in, looking smug as usual. She didn't notice me right away, but when she did, her face twisted in surprise. She probably thought I was just there to watch, maybe with a notebook in hand, but I had other plans. The meeting went as usual at first. Janet started talking about more rules she wanted to implement, more fines she wanted to add, and more ways to control the neighborhood. But as she spoke, I could see the others starting to lose interest. They weren't as eager to follow her lead anymore. Then, when it was my turn to speak, I stood up and addressed the room. I didn't raise my voice or yell. I simply spoke the truth. You know, Janet here has been running the show for a while. She's been making all these rules. But how many of you really agree with them? How many of you are tired of being treated like you don't matter? The room went silent. Everyone was listening. Janet's face was turning red, and I could see her trying to regain control. But it was too late. I had planted the seed. The next few days were tense, the air thick with anticipation. I could almost feel the shift in the neighborhood, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for someone to make the first move. Janet had always been the one pulling the strings, but now she was the puppet. I could see it in the way she walked past my cabin, her head held high, but her eyes darting around, as if searching for something, anything to regain control. But the truth was, she had already lost. She had underestimated me. She had no idea that her perfect, carefully constructed world was about to collapse around her. And as much as I wanted to just sit back and enjoy the view, I knew I had to keep the pressure on. I had already made my point, but now it was time to finish this, to really turn the tables. I could hear Janet talking to the HOA board, whispering behind closed doors, trying to figure out how to undo the damage I had done. The thing was, she couldn't fix what wasn't broken. She had no idea what she was up against. I wasn't just some guy who would roll over because she said so. I wasn't going to let her drag me through the mud. I was done being her punching bag, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. It wasn't long before the HOA sent another letter, another fine, another threat. The words were the same as always. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in further fines and potential legal action. But this time, it was different. The letter was laced with desperation. I could sense it. They knew they were losing control. And that's when the real fun began. I'd spent the last few weeks playing by their rules. It wasn't easy, but I had followed every guideline, every tiny little detail. But now, I was done with it. I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. I was going to hit them where it hurt, and I was going to do it in the most unexpected way. I started small, really small. At first, it was just little things, tiny things that would barely register but would get under Janet's skin. I started turning my yard into something she would never expect. I didn't want it to look like an eyesore, but I made sure it stood out. The grass? Neatly trimmed, but I let the edges grow a little longer than usual. The flowers? Still there, but I added a few bold colors that didn't quite match the HOA-approved palette. The mailbox? It wasn't too high anymore, but I adjusted it just enough to make sure it wasn't the exact same as everyone else's. But the real magic came when I started taking it to the next level. Janet had always been obsessed with the perfect lawn, the perfect garden, the perfect everything. So I started making her life a little more interesting. It wasn't anything drastic at first, but I started adding little touches to her yard, things she would never expect. I would leave random things like empty flower pots or a broken garden gnome in the middle of her perfectly manicured lawn. It wasn't enough to make it look like a complete disaster, but it was enough to make her question everything she had worked so hard to control. And then I did something that really made her snap. I started leaving signs, subtle little hints that would slowly drive her insane. I printed out some fake flyers and stuck them on her mailbox, ones that looked like official HOA notices, with new rules that she had never heard of. New HOA regulations, maximum lawn height 5 inches, one said. Another one read, mandatory flower arrangement change by next month. It wasn't just the signs. It was the way they looked so official, so real, and how they started to pile up on her front door. Janet didn't know what to do. She was starting to lose control, and she didn't even know how to fight back. She tried to act like it wasn't getting to her, but I could see it. The twitch in her eye when she walked past my cabin. The way she would stop and stare at the fake signs that I had posted around her yard as if she were trying to figure out how to make them disappear without anyone noticing. It was clear that the facade she had built was starting to crumble, and I wasn't about to stop until it completely fell apart. I didn't expect Janet to retaliate immediately, though. I knew she would try to come up with some sort of master plan to get back at me, but what could she do? The HOA couldn't take action because I was following their rules to the letter. They couldn't fine me for doing exactly what they had asked. They couldn't touch me, and that made them even more desperate. What made the situation even more delicious was that as much as Janet tried to maintain her control over the neighborhood, more and more neighbors started to take notice. They started questioning the rules. They started talking behind her back. And soon enough, I wasn't the only one fighting back. The whispers grew louder. People were getting fed up. Janet had become the neighborhood tyrant, and no one liked a tyrant. One evening, as I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the chaos unfolding, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. I turned to see Janet standing at the end of my driveway. Her posture was stiff, her hands clenched into fists by her sides. I couldn't help but smile. I knew what was coming. She had been planning this for weeks. She stormed up to me, her voice shaking with fury. "This has gone far enough. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can get away with this?" I took a slow breath, looking her right in the eye. "Janet, I'm just following the rules, just like you told me to." Her eyes widened, and for a moment I could see the real anger underneath her usual calm exterior. "You've made a mockery of everything I've worked for, everything this neighborhood is about, and now you're ruining it for everyone." I shook my head, not backing down. "No, Janet, I'm just giving everyone a taste of what it's like to live in your world, a world where rules are more important than people." She looked like she was about to explode, but instead of arguing, she turned on her heel and stormed off. I could see her shaking with rage as she walked away, knowing she was losing. She had no power here. Not anymore. But here's the thing. Janet was just the beginning. The more she fought back, the more people started to see the cracks in her perfect world. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about everyone else she had trampled over to get to where she was. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the birds chirping, the sun breaking through the trees, and a text message from Janet. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting to wake up to, but it was clear she wasn't backing down. The text was short, to the point, and dripping with that familiar sense of entitlement. "We need to talk. HOA meeting at 3 p.m. today. I suggest you be there." For a second I almost laughed. Janet wasn't just angry anymore. She was desperate. She had resorted to the classic move, calling a meeting, hoping to rally the troops and get the HOA on her side. But I wasn't worried. In fact, I was more than ready for this. She thought she was in control, but what she didn't realize was that I had already shifted the balance of power. I didn't respond to her text. Instead, I went about my morning routine as if this was just another day. But I knew things were about to escalate. I had made my point with the signs, the fake HOA notices, the subtle chaos I had unleashed on her perfect world. Now, it was time to bring everything into the open. It was time to let everyone see who Janet really was. The HOA meeting was set up in the usual community hall. When I arrived, I could see Janet at the front, sitting at the head of the table, her face tight with anger. The rest of the board members were already seated, looking slightly uncomfortable. I could tell they weren't thrilled to be there. They didn't want to be in the middle of this battle between Janet and me. But they had no choice. Janet looked up as I entered the room, her eyes flashing with recognition. She wasn't expecting me to show up, and the surprise was written all over her face. But instead of backing down, I walked straight to my seat at the table, giving her a polite nod as I sat down. "Let's get this over with," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I'm sure you have some important points to make, Janet." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she started flipping through the papers in front of her, trying to gather her thoughts. The silence in the room was thick. No one wanted to be the first to speak, and I was happy to let her stew for a bit. The power had shifted, and she knew it. The meeting wasn't going to go the way she expected. Finally, she cleared her throat. "We're here today because of the issues with my cabin's design," she began, her voice icy. "It has caused problems within the neighborhood, and frankly, it's disrupting the peace we've worked so hard to create." I raised an eyebrow. "Disrupting the peace?" I repeated, letting the words linger in the air. "It's funny you say that, Janet. I've been following every single rule you've put in place. I've painted my mailbox, trimmed my bushes, kept my lawn in perfect condition. So tell me, how exactly have I been disrupting the peace?" Her eyes narrowed. "You know exactly what I mean. The way your cabin stands out, the color, the style. It doesn't belong here." "Does it not belong?" I asked, leaning forward. "Or is it just that it doesn't fit your idea of perfection?" She opened her mouth to retort, but I wasn't done. "Janet, I'm not the one causing a disruption here. You've been the one throwing fines, threatening people, dictating how everyone should live. You've been using the HOA to enforce your own personal agenda, and now you're upset because someone dared to push back?" The room was silent. I could feel the tension building, but I wasn't backing down. Janet was unraveling, and the more she tried to control the situation, the more obvious it became that she wasn't the one in charge anymore. I turned to the other board members who were nervously watching the exchange. "I've heard the whispers. People are tired of Janet's rules. They're tired of being made to feel like they're not good enough because their lawns aren't the right shade of green or their mailbox isn't exactly the right height. The truth is, the HOA hasn't been about the community anymore. It's about her." One of the board members, a man in his late 50s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's not entirely accurate," he muttered, but he wasn't looking at Janet. He was looking at the rest of us, his gaze flickering between me and Janet. "Maybe we've all been a little too focused on rules and not enough on people," another board member added softly. "Maybe it's time to rethink how we're running things around here." Janet's face turned red with rage. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "You can't just let him get away with this. He's ruining everything." But her words fell flat. The room had already started to turn. The whispers I had heard outside the meeting were becoming louder, and I could see the board members starting to lose their confidence in her. Janet was no longer the unchallenged leader. She was just a woman trying to hold on to a title that no longer meant anything. "I'm not ruining anything, Janet," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm just giving people the freedom to live how they want. That's what this should be about. People should be able to express themselves without fear of being fined for not following your vision of the perfect neighborhood." Janet opened her mouth to argue, but this time, no words came out. She was choking on the truth. The very thing she had built her life around was falling apart right in front of her. "I think it's time we had a vote," I said, cutting through the tension. "A vote on whether or not we want someone like Janet running the HOA. Let the community decide what kind of leadership they want." The room was silent for a moment before one of the other board members nodded. "I agree. Let's vote." And just like that, the tide had turned. Janet, the woman who had controlled everything, was no longer in charge. The board members were beginning to see the light, and the people of the neighborhood were starting to re-see. Elise that they didn't have to live in fear of her rules anymore. The vote was a formality, or so Janet thought. But as the board members started casting their ballots, I could feel the room shift. The power that Janet had held so tightly for so long was slipping through her fingers. She could barely hide the desperation in her eyes, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table, white-knuckled. She had expected to walk into that room and reclaim control, but instead she was facing the very thing she feared most, losing everything. I watched as the board members went one by one, scribbling their votes on pieces of paper. Some of them glanced at Janet briefly, as if seeking her approval, but the rest were too focused on their own consciences. The whispers had gotten louder outside the meeting room, and it was clear that the people were starting to see through Janet's facade. The idea that she was the perfect HOA president, an authority everyone had to bow to, was crumbling piece by piece. When it came time to count the votes, I watched Janet carefully. Her face was stiff, a mask of control, but I could see the anxiety in her eyes. She knew, deep down, that the tide had turned. This wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. She was losing her grip on the neighborhood, and for the first time, she didn't know what to do about it. As the board member tallied the votes, the room fell into an almost eerie silence. Each second felt like an eternity. I could hear the clock ticking in the background, the sound growing louder as it counted down to the inevitable. Janet shifted in her chair, unable to sit still. She was itching to speak, to interrupt, but she knew better. If she said the wrong thing now, it would only confirm what everyone was starting to think about her. The board member looked up, his face neutral, as he slowly folded the papers and laid them down on the table. The vote was unanimous. Everyone had voted to remove Janet as HOA president. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. For a moment no one spoke. No one moved. The reality of what had just happened started to sink in. Janet was done. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief and rage. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Finally, her voice broke through the silence, raw and desperate. You can't do this," she said, the words strangled with emotion. "I'm the one who built this neighborhood. I made this HOA what it is. You can't just throw me away like this." I stood up slowly, letting the silence hang in the air before I spoke. "Janet, it's not about you anymore. It never was. It's about the people. And they're tired of being controlled by someone who thinks they're above it all." The board members exchanged uncertain glances, their faces a mix of guilt and relief. Janet's eyes darted from one person to the next, but no one met her gaze. The walls she had built around herself, walls made of authority, manipulation, and fear, were crumbling, and she had no one left to turn to. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "I'll fight this. You'll regret this. I'll take you all down." I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but it was more than that. It was the satisfaction of watching someone who thought they were untouchable realize just how fragile their power was. Janet had spent so long controlling everyone else, but in the end, it was her own hubris that had undone her. As she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, the board members turned to me, their expressions a mix of relief and uncertainty. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, wondering what was next. Janet had been a constant figure in the neighborhood for so long that they didn't know what to do without her. I wasn't concerned about that. What mattered now was what came next for the neighborhood. No longer would we be slaves to one person's will. No longer would the HOA be about enforcing rules that made no sense. It would be about freedom, about allowing people to live how they wanted, without fear of retribution. The power had shifted. Janet's reign was over, and now it was time for the neighborhood to rebuild. As I left the meeting, a sense of calm settled over me. I had done it. I had stood up to the HOA, to Janet, and to everything she represented. But this was just the beginning. The real challenge now would be making sure the HOA didn't go back to the same old ways. I wasn't going to let that happen. I had a voice now, and I wasn't going to be silent. The following week, I started working with the other residents to create a new, more inclusive HOA. One that wasn't about rules for the sake of rules, but about respecting each other's individuality. The old guard of the HOA was gone, and it was time for a new chapter. But there was still one thing that nagged at me. Janet had promised to fight back. She wasn't the kind of person who just gave up. I knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just the beginning of a new kind of war. A war where I wasn't the one on the defensive. But for now, I was enjoying the victory. I was living in a world where I finally had a say. The only question left was, what was Janet going to do now? It wasn't over, not by a long shot. I knew Janet wouldn't just fade into the background after losing her position as HOA president. She wasn't the type to accept defeat with grace. No, Janet was the kind of person who fought to the bitter end, and I could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break. A week after the vote, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the peace that had settled over the neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the weight of Janet's control had lifted. People were starting to speak freely, to actually live in their homes without worrying about violating some obscure HOA rule. It was a new day, and it felt good. But that feeling of peace was short-lived. It happened in the middle of the afternoon. I was sitting there, a cup of coffee in hand, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car screeching to a halt in front of my driveway. I looked up, only to see Janet's car parked haphazardly in the middle of the road. She had arrived, and this time she wasn't coming for a friendly chat. I stood up slowly, my heart rate picking up as I watched her step out of the car. She was wearing that same expression she had worn during our last confrontation. Eyes narrow, lips pressed into a thin line. But now there was something different in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was determined. And if there's one thing I had learned about Janet, it was that when she was determined, things got ugly. I took a deep breath and walked toward the driveway. I wasn't going to let her get to me. I wasn't going to back down. This was my neighborhood now, and she needed to understand that. "Janet," I said, my voice calm but firm. "What's going on? What do you want?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stood there, glaring at me like she was sizing me up, trying to figure out what my next move would be. Then, she finally spoke, her voice cold, calculated. "You think you've won, don't you?" she asked, her words dripping with venom. "You think you've beaten me. But this isn't over. You think you've taken my power away? You're wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" She smirked, a dark, unsettling smile. "You'll see soon enough. I'm not done with you. I'll make sure the HOA comes after you. I'll make sure everyone knows just what kind of person you really are." I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I wasn't going to let her see it. "You can try, Janet, but you can't control this neighborhood anymore. You've lost." She took a step closer, her eyes flashing with rage. "You think you can just throw me out and get away with it? You think the HOA will just let you destroy everything I've worked for?" She was right about one thing. She wasn't going to go down quietly. But that only made the situation even more interesting. I wasn't about to let her tear everything I had worked for apart. The neighborhood had finally taken a stand, and I wasn't going to let her ruin that. "I don't need to destroy anything, Janet," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not like you. But what I will do is make sure the HOA follows the rules and works for the people, not for one person's personal agenda. If you can't handle that, then maybe it's time for you to move on." Her face twisted in anger. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea what I'm capable of. You'll regret this." And with that, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her car, slamming the door so hard that the whole street seemed to shake. I watched her drive off, the dust from her tires hanging in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Janet had gone down, but she was far from finished. I could feel it in my gut. She would be back, and this time, she wouldn't be alone. The next few days were strangely quiet. The board had been making decisions without Janet, and the neighborhood was slowly returning to some sense of normalcy. I kept my head down, not wanting to stir the pot too much, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension. It was only a matter of time before Janet made her next move. And then, it happened. A few weeks later, I was out in my yard, enjoying the crisp morning air, when I noticed something strange. There were more signs popping up in the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had put up a yard sale sign or an event flyer, but no. These were HOA notices. They looked official, even though they had clearly been printed at home. They were targeting specific homes, including mine. I walked over to one of the signs, reading the text that was written in bold letters. "Notice of violation, unauthorized construction, immediate action required." I ripped the sign out of the ground and looked around. There were more scattered across the neighborhood. Janet had found a way to fight back, and she wasn't doing it alone. She had somehow rallied a group of people who were still loyal to her, still willing to follow her reign of terror. I couldn't believe it. Janet had gone rogue, and now she was using the very system she had once controlled to tear down everything we had worked for. This was her last-ditch effort to regain her power, and it was clear that she wasn't going to stop until she had destroyed everything. But here's the thing. I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Janet had made her move, but so had I. This neighborhood wasn't hers to control anymore, and I wasn't going to let her tear it apart. I wasn't the only one who had had enough. People started talking, started organizing. The neighborhood wasn't going to let Janet turn it into a battleground. We weren't going to sit back and watch her destroy everything we had built.